All right, so let's talk about some fundamentals. Specifically, we're going to be talking about variables. Okay. Now, variables in JavaScript, we're going to be really discussing two different types. There's built-in variables, variables that already are doing stuff for us, and you have seen some of these. And then we're going to talk about how to create our own variables. Okay. And this is, like the videos that we've seen, it's just a different type of abstraction for us to be able to do things. It allows us to do a lot more. Okay. Now, a variable, and you can see the definition, but really what it is when we create a variable, we are setting some space aside on a computer or a computer program to hold the value of something. And when we put a variable, it's that really is the name or the location that I'm going to store that stuff. Once I create that variable, that is what's going to be there. So when I call that variable, I'm calling whatever was stored there. Okay. Now we have played around with some variables already. You guys have already seen them. Width and height is it's specifically talking about the canvas size. Okay. But the width can represent the very largest X that I could have on my canvas or my screen. The height can represent the very largest Y value that I could have on my screen. Mouse X and mouse Y, we haven't seen that much yet, but the mouse X position and mouse Y position, all they're doing is they're variables that are holding the current position of my mouse. So whenever I move my mouse around, they are updated in the code. And what I can do is I can access those variables, the built-in mouse X and mouse Y, and I could use that to maybe draw images or have things move in relation to my mouse moving. Okay. Now, variables, really a very simple definition, because you guys have seen these before. You have any type of algebra that you have done where you have to find the value of x. The value of x has always been there, even if you didn't know what the value was. That equation that x was in was still true, even if you didn't know what that value was. So really all we're doing is we are learning how to be able to define a variable so that we can use it in different types of equations. Okay, so I like to think of it like a box. Basically, we put a name on a box, like we're moving, and we want to store something in that box, and then we can move somewhere where we get to our location, and we can look for the box that has that specific name, so I know what room it's going into, and then I can pull whatever's stored in there. Okay, so that is really called the initialization phase. It's when I give it a name. And I do this with the keyword let. I type let, and then I give it a name. Now, generally, you want to have your name be a descriptive name so you know what you're trying to store in that variable. Okay, so we put information in that variable. That's what we're storing there when we assign it to that variable name. So then when I call that variable name, I am basically pulling that information. I'm dumping it out of the box. Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that variables, when we put some information in there, we can only put one thing at a time. We can only ever have one thing. So when if I put something in there, like maybe I wanted to store a sentence in with my variable, then if I ever wanted to put anything else in there, it's basically like I have to empty that box to put something else in. I can never try to pull something else out if I put something else in. I can only ever carry one thing at a time. That is the big, big thing to remember with variables, okay? So as soon as you put something else in, you already dumped out whatever was in that variable, okay? Now, when we put something in with the variable, that is called either the assignment phase or the declaration phase. The initialization phase is when we create the variable name, we save that memory space. The declaration or assignment phase is when we actually put information in it, okay? Now, for variables, there are many, many types, and JavaScript is a very unique language. JavaScript and other dynamic language other dynamic languages. Python's another dynamic language. I can put a variable like a number, and then I can put, something completely different, like a Boolean value, something that is true or false, or a string. It doesn't really matter what I want to put in there, okay? And that's why, JavaScript is the most widely used language out there right now. It's a very popular language because it is somewhat forgiving, okay? So when we're talking about numbers that we can put in there, that could be whole numbers, it could be numbers with zeros, it can be decimal numbers. It doesn't really matter in terms of JavaScript. That is something that we could store in there. We can also store strings, okay? Now, strings is kind of a weird word to say, but we are basically storing, anything from one letter to a full paragraph to a book. That could technically be all stored as a string. Okay, it's a string of text. Okay, so I could have something like a sentence. I could have something like just a phrase. That is still a string, but that is something that we could store in a variable. A Boolean value. Boolean really just means something that is like off or on, and we usually represent that by just true and false. Okay, so Boolean values actually are super, super useful. We like to use them all the time. We can use them in video game design, to say, hey, this space has been visited or it has not. If the hero has a key, if that's true, then, we can open the door. If he doesn't and it's false, then we cannot open the door. So we do need Boolean values to help branch our code, and we can store those in variables to use later. We will eventually get into objects for variables. Now, variables could hold things. So in programming, a lot of times you are really trying to model the real world. So if I think of a thing like a ball could have a color, it could have a weight, it could have a size, it could have a certain amount of bounciness, it could have a certain amount of shininess. That is something that I could store as a variable. So that is kind of one of the examples of a way that you could actually have a little bit more information than just one thing, because it's one object. And we'll get into a little bit more details on how to use those and how to use those effectively, but we need to understand how to use simple variables first. Okay, so like what I was talking about with the initialization, there is a certain type of syntax. So what is syntax? Syntax is a way that I have to write. Just like English, you start all sentences with a capital letter. With all ends of the sentences, you finish with some type of punctuation, like a period, question mark, or exclamation mark. Okay, the syntax that we need to do for initializing a variable is to use the keyword let, okay? And then we have a space, and then we type a variable name. Now, variable names can be one word, they can be many words. But there is kind of a certain type of methodology on how we write our variable names to make it so it's easy to read, not just for us, but for many people, okay? You are not programming for yourself, you're programming for the person behind you who might look at your code later on, okay? Now, one of the ways that we can do this is that variable names, if we want them to be very descriptive, to explain what we have in that variable, we want to have something that is very clear. So an example is, instead of me just saying, x1 or x or toodles as my variable name, it doesn't really say much, okay? But something like maybe position x, that's a lot clearer in my programming, and I would understand, well, okay, we're looking for an x value that is being stored there. The same as we have the built-ins are mouse x, mouse y. Those are very clear of what they do, okay? We can guess what information is there by looking at it. Now, when we are writing variable names, we cannot use spaces in our name. So there is like a way that we got to write. There's actually certain words that we can't use for variables, and I will display those in a little bit. Your variable names have to start with either a letter or an actual underscore. You can't start it with a number, okay? So this would be a good example, like underscore letter, position, something to that effect we can use. Bad examples would be trying to start something with numbers and that type of stuff. Okay, this makes it a little unclear what you're trying to do. So we would want to start with a letter or an underscore. Okay. Now variables, when we create them, they're case sensitive. Okay. So that means that if we wrote our variable with a capital letter to start it out, and then we try to call it later on and we write, all lowercase, they're not the same thing. So that is why for variables, we actually like to write all normal variables, so what you guys would be using for this course, all normal variables as camel case. Why do we say camel case? Because in the middle of the variable, there is going to be a hump, all right? And what is that hump? That hump is a capital letter. Every time we start a new word, after the first word, so the second word, the third word, the fourth word, the fifth word, doesn't matter. Every time we start another word, we're not putting a space to recognize it, we're putting a capital letter. You actually can't have a space in a variable name, it will error out. So here's an example. If I wanted to store a value, say Monterey, California, I'll say that that's my favorite place to visit, and that is what I stored in a variable. Now, my variable name, I wanted to initialize it as favorite place to visit. It's very easy for me to see where each word starts because it always starts with a capital letter, okay? So that is camel case. My expectation is that you guys will use these rules when you guys are writing and creating your own variables. So I'm looking to see that you guys are writing with camel case, okay? Now here are the reserved words that we can't use. We cannot create a variable name called let when we have to use let as the keyword to let JavaScript know that we're going to create a variable. There's other ones that we can't really use. The for keyword. If I have this by itself, the for actually is part of a function to create a loop. While is also part of a function to create a loop. Boolean is actually a type of variable. So I can't use these type of words. This is a list and they're in your reference material, okay? Because JavaScript cannot understand when these are supposed to introduce other things. So you cannot use these by themselves as a variable name. Now I could say, let's say I wanted to use this word, new, which we can use when we're trying to create some new objects and we're using a class structure. If I wanted to create a variable that was a new X position for a character in a game that I'm making, and I have his previous X position, I can, create a new variable, but I'm not going to call it let new to hold that new position. I might write something more, and then it would be okay, like let new X position, and write it in camel case. Because it's not new by itself, it's perfectly fine, okay? So just the words by themselves, I cannot use as variables from this list. Okay, continuing on. All right, so variables, when we're talking about variables that we create, the built-in variables, those are examples of global variables. It does not matter where I use them. They always are holding a value. They always are accessing the same thing. But variables can have different scopes. And what do we mean by that? They can exist for all of my program, or they can exist for only part of it. Maybe I have a certain variable name that I actually like to reuse in different ways to do a calculation, like X value and Y value. If I'm trying to do some math, and instead of me thinking of 1,000 different variables, I just want to use x value every time I have an equation that needs an x. And then I can put stuff in there. If I create it as a local variable, then it will only exist inside of that piece of code, which we will call a code block. So I'm going to kind of show some examples in here to make it a little bit more clear. But local variables definitely have their place because we can create them so that they won't mess up any other code. They're only accessible right in that area. Okay, so global, let's talk about that first. Basically, if we were creating our own variable, we have to initialize the variable outside of any function or code. Usually we do it at the very top of our code, okay? For programmers that are coming after you, they are going to look for your variables. So they should not be looking at the very bottom of your code or anything like that. They should be looking at the very top. So it's standard for you to have all of your global variables at the very top of your code, like starting at line 1 on your sketch, okay? They can be assigned a value anywhere and they will hold that value. So it doesn't matter where I put a value in. If I wanted to add something to that value or take away or put a completely new value, when I access that variable again, it's still going to hold that value. Okay, so here is an example. I am using the keyword let and then my variable name, okay? And this is holding master width, okay? Now, master width, you guessed it, is going to hold the width of my canvas, the master width of my program. It's very descriptive. And it's also written in camel case. Notice the W is capital. Okay, so this master width, I initialize it outside of any blocks of code. What is a block of code? A block of code is where you see a squiggle bracket and another squiggle bracket. They're always in pairs, okay? When we declare the variable, we can declare it inside of a code block and it will still hold the value anywhere else. So here we have declared the value, or we're assigning the value of 500 to the variable master width. I can call it anywhere. I can access it. I can even store new information there. So when I store the 450 value to master width like I did on line 10, there is no more value of 500 and master width. It's like I wrote over it. Whatever was in there, I dumped it out, put something else in. Okay, that is a global variable. We can use it anywhere. There's no issues. We can easily use it. We can access it. That is a global scope. Okay. Now, a local scope means that we initialize inside of a block of code. Okay. Now, we've already seen some examples of functions. We haven't learned conditionals yet. Loops is not something that we really cover in this class, but any block of code, a piece of code that does something by itself, okay? So a code block, we always can see them because they're always going to be in pairs with the squiggle brackets. So see here, we have initialized the variable master width. Now that is inside of this code block, okay, right here. Now, when we're using a variable, we always have to do it after it's been initialized. So that means this let master width has to be before I try to store value in it or try to access what that master width is, okay? But because it is after this initialization phase and it's in between these code blocks, then there is a value. Conversely, if I try to access master width, this specific master width, here, it does not exist. JavaScript will actually try to create another variable that's a global variable for master width. And they're two different things, and it will make it very confusing because you will try to change values for this master width, thinking you're changing values for this one, but it does not. It doesn't exist. This only exists in between this code block. So it's something that we have to get used to. If we're going to use global variables, that's something we can access anywhere. Local variables we can only access in between the code block. So when we try to look for this variable to pull up this one is the one that we want, we just can't find it, okay? It does not exist, okay? So that is the major differences between variables. Now, when we want to call a variable, when I say that, really it just means I am typing the variable name exactly how I created it, okay? So when I type the variable name, it's like I'm taking that box and I'm just dumping out whatever the contents are, okay? It's really, really easy to think of it that way. That's really the end of the video, okay? It's not a hard concept, but we need to see some examples to really drive it home. So in the next video, that's what we're going to be talking about. In this one, really, we just covered, what variables are, built-in and local variable, or built-in and variables that we create. And then we talked about the difference in scope between global and local. So let's go ahead and play around with some examples in the next video. Good luck. Have fun.